you Killer Wives, episode 52. Killing the Raven. These are the case facts against Deidre Lane, who killed her husband to save her dirty little secret. Isn't trust a bitch? Charlotte, North Carolina, famed birthplace of Billy Graham, the NASCAR Hall of Fame, but also made famous for the murder of Baltimore Raven, Fred Lane.
In Iran, 67% of women who killed their husbands were assisted by another man because they wanted out of the marriage. A similar metric minus the other man played out in Charlotte, North Carolina on July 6, 2000. There, shortly after Deidre Lane's husband of 21 months arrived back in town. Mere weeks before Fred Lane was shot by his wife, he had awoken in the dead of night to finding her standing over him, pointing a .380 caliber handgun at his head. At the other end of that weapon was Deidre, who asked Fred, "Have you ever thought about what it's like to die?" What a question from a wife. Now, Lane didn't scare easily. With the same decisiveness he used to squirt past linebackers, he snatched the weapon from her and said, "If you're gonna shoot me, be a woman enough to shoot me where I can see you." Now, I dare to say there's not too many men that could do something like that. On the Saturday before the murder, Fred Lane Sr. said his daughter-in-law had fired a shot through a wall at their Charlotte home 2 weeks before the fatal shooting. Now, this woman has a problem with handling weapons. Now, the bullet penetrated the walls between the couple's upstairs bedroom and the baby's room. If there's any indication that she should not handle a weapon, this would be the one. Now, Fred ran upstairs to find his pregnant wife sitting in their bedroom. In front of her was a 6-inch hole in the wall where she fired a 12-gauge shotgun he didn't know she had. Now, the blast exit point was in her son Grant's bedroom. Grant was staying elsewhere that night. But Deidre later covered the hole in Grant's wall with a Mickey Mouse drawing, but never bothered to discard the 9 pellets scattered on the floor or the 17 others embedded in his bookshelf. Now, she never explained why she fired the shot. Maybe it was practice for the actual murder. The elder Lane stressed, however, that Miss Lane didn't shoot in the direction of her husband. To me, these were all precursors to the actual event and nothing more. Now, Fred took the shotgun, later giving it to his friend Bryant Peoples. Fred then threw some clothes in the back of his Expedition and peeled off. The man was out of there. Now, Fred then exclaimed to college teammate Rodney Simmons, "She can have it all. I'm through, man." But sadly, Fred wasn't through, just like a lot of men in these situations. And for a while, he stayed with his folks in his boyhood home in Nashville. Deidre called him there to tell him she was planning to induce labor. This was an ploy to get him back home. On the afternoon of June 20th, 2000, the same day, Deidre asked a clerk about shotguns at a local Kmart. Now, Fred, listening to this message, left a message for his wife. He said, "I'm coming back. Even if you don't want me in the hospital room, I'm going to be there anyway." When he returned to Charlotte to see his daughter, PR, born June 29th, he brought protection. His brother, Keith, and a friend, Howard Burns. So he needed people around him because he thought his wife was crazy. Now, Fred went back to Nashville, but then decided to make one last stop to Charlotte. His friends told him not to go, but Deidre bought him a plane ticket. One of his friends said, "We vowed never to let him go back by himself," but he said he had to sell his motorcycle and not to worry. Fred Sr. recalls, "I said, son, you gotta do what you gotta do." father did say that the couple had been experiencing marital troubles in recent months. The elder Lane said his son has been living most of the time with his family in Nashville since being traded to the Indianapolis Colts. Now, Floyd and two other Lane's other friends said Lane had told them that Deidre Lane had drained the couple's bank account of all of their shared assets. And in these killer wives cases, it's always the same. Before he dies or after he dies, the wife will drain the account. Now, Brian Pelps, a friend of Lane's in Charlotte, said he had to loan Lane a total of $155 on two separate occasions to get home after Lane told him he was broke. Now, according to Pelps, Lane said Deidre had told him she'd been sending money to a financial planner. And when Lane called the financial planner recently, he had no knowledge of the money's whereabouts. So that also was a ruse. Now, this type of challenging home life is why most NFL team managers try to advise their players to watch out for groupies who want to get married for position or money. Now, other managers suggest that the players wait until they are retired to get married at all, because in a lot of circles, women like money more than they like their husbands. But in Lane's brief 3-year career in professional football, many professional scouts and players would attest that Lane played much bigger than he was. Like a lot of undrafted players, Lane ran as if fairy tale depended on every carry. Now, Charlotte fans fell in love with the way he set aside his own well-being for that extra yard for the team. They loved that. His teammates loved him too. Fred was a simple guy, says Carolina wideout Muhsin Muhammad. He wore white t-shirts every day. He said he could have shopped at Walmart and been happy. Freddie had a joke for any occasion. He didn't want to do nothing but grin and play football, says friend Derek Caldwell. That's all he wanted to do, smile and run the route. How many people can say that about professional football players? He said if Deidre saw in Fred all the wonderful qualities his friends saw, they only wish they could see the same in her. In a lot of relationships, there are opposites, a positive spouse and a negative one. Now, Deidre had a personality like, if you do me wrong, I'll do you, says Muhammad. At Deidre's sentencing, Muhammad's wife, Krista, recalled a conversation with Deidre about Ray Caruth murder case, if you remember that one, in which the ex-Panther wideout and 3 others were found guilty of various crimes related to a drive-by shooting of his pregnant girlfriend at the time, Sharika Adams. Now, Sharika died a month later in hospital. Now, Krista testified that Deidre told her they should have shot her where they knew they would kill her right away, like in the head. What kind of woman would say this? The Lane's friend and family quickly noticed that Deidre's fuse was short and her leash even shorter. She didn't like their Fred signing autographs. She constantly changed their home phone number. He said, I remember we were in a comedy club after he had knee surgery. And this is a former teammate, William Floyd. And Deidre said something like, I ought to kick you in the knee. And my wife, he said, and I thought, whoa, what's going on with this particular family? Once again, who would say these challenging remarks? Now, Deidre's sniping at Fred often escalated to violence. He said Fred came to work with knots and scratches and bruises on him. It was to a point where I thought, do I call the police? Then I thought, no. For one thing, he'd have to deal with teammates saying, hey, you're letting your wife kick your butt. And this is a lot of reasons why men who are abused by their wife or ridiculed by their wife or berated by their wife don't go to the police. But the butt kicking was reciprocated at least on one occasion. At least a year before Fred's death, Deidre and her friend Margaret McWayne Turner returned to Lane residence after buying beer. Fred was in the kitchen on the phone. According to Turner, when he hung up, Deidre made a snide remark about the person on the other end of the phone. Now, Fred whipped a dish rag at her. She threw it back. Then Turner says Lane charged at Deidre, grabbing her by the neck and pushing her into the sink. She said her feet were in the air. Turner testified, and she was gasping. She said, I was shocked. At a certain point, everybody has a short fuse. Now, a few months later, Deidre called the cops after she claimed Fred yanked a necklace from her neck in an argument. At that time, she ran across the street to a neighbor's house with Fred chasing after her. Another neighbor told police that Fred was clearly drunk at that point. And for this, no charges were filed, especially she didn't push it any further because she had goaded the fight. But the worst of the war between the couples was to come. On the night of the tragic incident, Lane caught an afternoon flight from Nashville to Charlotte. He landed at Charlotte Douglas Airport at 2 p.m. His brother-in-law then picked him up at the airport and dropped him at their couple's home. At this point, Lane has little less than an hour to live. Now, Deidre was in the house and she had already chambered a round in a shotgun she was going to kill her husband with. Hard to imagine that any woman would purposely plan to slaughter her husband, but she did. You see, Deidre was no innocent woman. In July 1995, Deidre Lane, then Deidre Gary, was charged with the attempted armed robbery of the South Carolina's credit union in Columbia, as per the FBI's own records. On the day of the robbery, she entered the credit union and told the teller she had a gun and demanded money, but she left without any cash. Now, Deidre was arrested about 20 minutes later at her own home. She was not married at the time. Around the murder, the Lanes had been separated due to strife in the marriage. But for all intents and purposes, Fred Lane's career left his wife Deidre Lane set for life if she had never messed with the family's finances. Now you see, she had a big new house in the suburban Charlotte area, a 5-year-old son with another on the way, and a life most 25-year-old women would envy. But this was not enough for Deidre any more than it is for any killer wife we have presented to you on this program. Now, prior to newborn's birth, Fred had been recently traded to the Indianapolis Colts, as I said before, which caused strife between the young couple. Deidre and Fred began fighting over money that she had been misappropriating, as well as the amount of time he spent on the road in professional football. It's a unique thing. If you marry somebody in professional sports, they're going to be traveling. This brings us to the scene of the murder. That night, Fred may have wondered who set the alarm that greeted him as he walked through the front door of his house on July the 6th. Now, according to Lane's own maid, they almost never used this particular alarm. Now, holding a cup in one hand and 2 bags in the other, Fred made his way into the house, probably to shut this alarm off. And Deidre was waiting for him there with a fully loaded 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun. Moments after the last shot rang out, the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Department would receive a frantic 911 call from the Lane residence. Deidre Lane had just shot Fred twice with the weapon, and in a minute we're going to give you that call. Now, the first shot ripped through his yellow Tommy Hilfiger shirt, shredding his upper right chest, caught him off guard, and in fear for his life, dying, Fred slumped face down into a growing pool of blood and began to crawl back to the front door as an escape. But the guy was already dead. Then Deidre walked toward him, straddled his left leg, and fired into the back of his head. Then the blast tore off half his skull. With the close shot, blood and brain matter was splattered everywhere, including on Deidre. Deidre herself had become covered in her husband's blood. She set down the shotgun and dialed 911. By then, police say, Fred was dead in a heap in the entranceway. The hysterical Deidre is captured on 911 tape trying to soothe her screaming week-old baby in the background. And it would be on this phone call that Deidre would draft a lie so twisted and delusional concerning self-defense against a man who meant her no immediate harm. The 911 tape covered the time from when she called until the police were inside of the couple's home. We give you now a reenactment of the actual conversation after the Panthers' murder in Charlotte. Charlotte Mecklenburg 911, do you need police, fire, or ambulance?
I think I shot him in the chest or the stomach. I think I just shot him again. I don't know. Please send somebody. There's blood everywhere. There's blood all over me.
Is he breathing?
I don't know. I didn't go anywhere near him. I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry. He just walked in the door like 2 or 3 or 4 minutes ago. He wasn't even here that long. I was just coming back from the kitchen and he just said, someone told me that that's not my baby. I don't even know if he dropped his luggage. I was standing here and he came in. I just had the baby 7 days ago. And he came in and he started choking me and he was like, that baby's not mine. And he started hitting me and he just got shot because he wouldn't leave me alone. And I kept telling him to stop. I was so scared. I just shot him again. And as he assaulted me before. It was in the paper once, but I denied it. I mean, I didn't really tell my friends, but I was so embarrassed because of who he is. He always told me if I ever told anybody, he'd make it worse and I'd ruin his career.
Okay, we'll send a car right over there.
1043, transport is on the way. I'm running over there now.
Now, as you can see, Deidre claims she killed Fred in self-defense. But when Mecklenburg County deputies arrived at the house, something about Deidre's story didn't seem quite right. Fred's keys were still in the lock, and Fred had been shot twice with a 12-gauge shotgun. Once in the chest and the second time in the back of the head, apparently at point-blank range. Now, how is this self-defense? Now, obviously, Fred could not have assaulted his wife if he had barely made it into the door of the house with the keys still in the lock. Now, the facts reveal that what actually happened is that his wife awaited his arrival like a sniper in a perch until he opened that front door. That is not self-defense. That's premeditated murder. It was then that she made a well-placed shot, targeting him to her husband's chest, mortally wounding him and making him collapse onto the hardened floor. There is no worse way to die. When police arrived at the residence, Fred Lane's keys were in the door, as I said. His bags were still in the foyer, and a 12-gauge shotgun was on the floor. Now, if it was up to her, she'd make it look like suicide, but you can't shoot yourself twice. Now, paramedics were called to the scene by police at about 3 p.m. He was pronounced dead at 3:15 p.m. The medical examiner removed Lane's body from the house nearly 5 hours later. Now, blood spatter patterns indicated that the first shotgun blast hit Fred Lane in the chest. The shot, in effect, blew out Fred Lane's heart. As Fred Lane lay there dying, Deidre Lane, as I said before, walked through his blood and put the shotgun up to his head and blew his skull off. Now, this from a person who swore to love, honor, and cherish. Now, authorities who spoke with Deidre the evening of the shooting said via a statement that she had shot her husband during a domestic dispute. They actually believed her. Now, police decided not to file charges, but Mecklenburg County prosecutors will ultimately decide whether she should be charged in Lane's death later. Now, I guess just as long as you can say you face domestic violence by mouth, it is good enough for authorities. I guess as long as you're a wife, not a husband. Now, subsequent autopsy revealed one gun blast struck behind the right ear, right? Now, it traveled upward slightly to the left. That's her standing over him. And slightly forward. Now, this entering his skull and his brain. Now, an X-ray revealed about 16 shotgun pellets, most of which were recovered from the skull and scalp. The same pellets that were on the floor in her son's room when she shot through the wall. Now, the other blast struck Lane in the upper right chest, as I said, traveling to the left and slightly downward and injuring his heart, lungs, and other internal organs. In effect, he was already dead. Now, police confirmed that Deidre Lane brought her week-old infant with her to the police station when she was being questioned. Now, she needed this to look like a victim. Now, Lane's 5-year-old son, Grant, was not present. According to the Panthers Media Guide, Lane also had a daughter, Regina Alexis, from a previous relationship. So now these children have no father. Now, Officer Tom Barry, a police spokesman, said the police were eager to quell any speculation that a stranger was involved in the shooting. Now, the Willamere neighborhood in which Lane lived had been the site of an unsolved murder last fall before his murder of a 7-year-old boy, Justin Marlowe Luter. Now, the coach, which was the team Fred was traded to, released a statement that said, the team was shocked and saddened by the news of Lane's death, and so was anybody that knew him, especially his family. Now, Lane's father, Fred Lane Sr., said his son and daughter-in-law had been having difficulties recently. Lane had spent a couple of weeks at the family home in Nashville, Tennessee, but visited Charlotte the night of the murder, as I said before. And he had left Tennessee on a flight to Charlotte about 2 hours before he was shot. Had he known that, he would never left his parents' house. Then several weeks later, Deidre was arrested and charged with murder. Before she could face those charges, she was charged by federal authorities for a 1998 bank robbery, which she orchestrated by herself. You did hear me, I didn't stutter, I did say she orchestrated a bank robbery. 3 years later, just 3 months before she married Fred, Deidre walked into the Wachovia Bank in Charlotte and handed Natasha Watson, a teller and co-conspirator, a note that read, "Give me all your money in the drawer, don't say anything, and hurry." And Deidre exited with $41,200 on September 2000 and convicted on October 2002. So 2 years later, she was convicted for robbing a bank. Now, as for her husband's death, Deidre Lane, 25 years at the time, turned herself in to the police for the murder charges. Deidre was then set free on a $100,000 bond while she awaited trial in the death of the former Carolina Panther player. Now, the charge in this case had Deidre facing life in prison or the death penalty if convicted of first-degree murder. This was murder, first degree. Now, prosecutors believe the evidence of the bank robbery was just one of the reasons she shot her husband, because Fred had gotten wind of her past transgressions and could possibly use this against her in a divorce and child custody hearings, and she could not have that. And the last thing she wanted Fred to do was to expose her dirty little secret. Now, secondly, Assistant District Attorney Gentry Caudill believed that Deidre Lane planned her husband's death to collect on a $5 million life insurance policy taken out between 30 and 45 days before the shooting. And in most of these killer wife cases, if you watched this before, there's always a financial payoff to murdering your husband. Now, at the lengthy sentencing hearing, her attorney alleged she was a battered spouse. You will always hear these as well. But prosecutors said it was Deidre who was violent and abusive. On October 2003, which was the trial date, during her a tearful Deidre Lane left the court twice, avoiding graphic testimony about her shooting of her late husband, NFL running back Fred Lane. She didn't want to be around to hear about what she actually did. Now, lawyers for Lane presented their first witness, an obstetrician who said Lane, the wife, told her 3 weeks before the shooting that she had been physically and verbally abused by her husband. So, to me, she was setting up her alibi in advance. Now, Deidre Lane spent most of the day slumped in her chair at the defense table, eyes cast downward and frequently crying. And she returned to the courtroom during morning testimony by Mecklenburg County Medical Examiner Dr. Michael Sullivan about his autopsy of Fred Lane. Now, this too, she would act like she was upset to hear about the graphic things that she did. And Lane left again just before a police department firearm expert showed a heavily bloodstained shirt that Fred Lane was wearing when he was killed. Now, in both cases, Superior Court Judge Timothy Patty allowed Lane to leave the courtroom after reminding her that she was waiving her constitutional right to be present at trial. Now, both the fire expert Bill McBrayer and Sullivan testified that they concluded Fred Lane was shot from a distance of 8 feet or less. So, he can't be choking you if it's a distance between the two. Now, Sullivan said that the first shot fired at Fred Lane, which struck him in the chest and ripped apart his heart, would cause a loss of consciousness very rapidly, within seconds, certainly less than a minute. So as I said before, he was already dead. Even though he turned slightly and crawled to the door, he was already dead. Now, Deidre Lane told police investigators her husband was still moving after she fired the first shot, and that she fired a second time because she thought he was going to get up and come back at her. And in all these killer wife cases, when they shoot the husband more than once, they always say the same statement. The prosecution included its case by showing photographs of the crime scene and a videotape reenactment of the shooting as it was described by Deidre Lane to the police investigators. So her own words didn't make sense. Now, the tape made 2 months after the shooting featured police detectives playing the roles of Fred and Deidre Lane. Among other things, the tape showed Deidre Lane would have had to been staying almost directly over her husband's prone body to have fired the second shot from 3 feet away, as Sullivan concluded. Now, that could have raised doubt about her claim that Fred Lane still threatened her when she shot him in the back of the head. Deidre, claiming self-defense, said she told her obstetrician that her husband had abused her. Her defense lawyer's documents filed in the case had argued that Fred Lane's abuse of his wife grew more frequent and severe in the weeks before his death, although Fred was out of town. Now, Fred Lane is alleged to have pushed Deidre Lane out of the car as he accelerated away to have grabbed her by the throat, lifted her off the ground, and thrown her into a sink. That's two different occasions. Now, nobody can testify for the dead man except for the court. He's not here to testify for himself. Under cross-examination, Delaney, the obstetrician, acknowledged that she never saw bruises or other physical signs of abuse or injury on Lane beyond a cut lip that Lane told her was an accident. After hearing the evidence, the judge sentenced Deidre to 8 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed. The Judge Timothy Patty ruled that the slaying was premeditated and deliberate, that Lane acted with malice, and that she shot her husband a second time after the first shot rendered him completely helpless. This was unnecessary. Now, those factors outweigh the alleged abuse, the judge said. Deidre broke down in tears as the judge read the sentence. She pleaded guilty only to voluntary manslaughter. For several days, the case made the front page of local papers, but interest in the story faded during the long run-up to the trial. 3 years later, as the court date finally approached, the trial was over before it even started. Deidre was off the hook for murder, allowed instead to plead to a state-cut deal. Now, at sentencing, Deidre was given the benefit of any allegations of domestic abuse, so they actually believed whatever she said. And in all these cases, when a guy's absent, he can't talk for himself. You can say whatever the hell you want to happen. Now, James Wyatt, a local criminal lawyer who followed the case, says he's not surprised by the plea. There was evidence and premeditation and intent, he says, but the prosecutor had to weigh that against the potential evidence relating to domestic abuse or self-defense. And this is what trips up a lot of guys in cases. If you're in a home where domestic violence is occurring from your wife, get out. Now, Deidre, who often excused herself from the courtroom during graphic testimony, was allowed to address the bench before Judge Timothy Patty handed down his sentence. She said, "To the Lane family, I am sorry for the loss of Fred. I love Fred dearly," she said. "He was a good man and a gentleman at times, but at times he scared me, and I didn't know who he was at the time." She went on to say, "I'm sorry for the pain that I've caused. I pray that one day you can forgive me because I do consider you my family." End quote. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to be family to a woman who just killed her closest love. As for that insurance policy, a settlement of slightly less than $4 million was reached. That's to be distributed equally among Fred's 3 daughters. And undisclosed, though a smaller portion, will be given to 8-year-old Grant, who now lives with his half-sister, Pilar, and Deidre's parents. Now, Deidre Lane's attorney, Henderson Hill, and Mecklenburg County Assistant District Attorney Marsha Goodnow, who is now prosecuting the case, both declined to comment on tape. Now, as in all these cases, there's an update. Years go by when people are in prison, but for her, there was a short time. On March 3, 2009, Deidre Lane, 33 years old at the time, was released after serving only 6 years for the shotgun death of her husband from the Raleigh Correctional Center for Women at 9:30 in the morning. Now, she walked out of that facility into a waiting BMW where relatives waited to take her home. She did not speak to authorities or reporters as she exited the prison. Now, considering this case, no one can explain why Fred and Deidre couldn't get away from each other. In the end, even Fred seemed confused by their sad marriage, as evidenced by his last voicemail to Deidre, in which he said this statement: "You hate me. You don't want to be with me no more. So why don't you leave me alone? Give me my paper. Let me ride on. It doesn't hurt. You don't want me? You don't want to be with me anymore? Well, damn. Enough is enough. You're tired? Okay, cool. You know what I mean." Then he ended the message with 2 words: "One love." The couple's baby girl was born a week before the murder at 2:15 a.m., June 29th, named Pilar Madison. Now, Pilar Madison Lane, 8 pounds 1 ounce 20 inches, is now a full-grown woman, as evidenced by this photo. For Killer Wives, this is Charles Rivers. Until we see you next time, watch out for this type of woman. Until next time.